Okay, welcome to our August Drinking Skeptically, the National Capillary of Skeptics. This is a slightly different meeting than we usually have. Usually we just have informal discussions and drinking or non-drinking and the like. Today we're pleased to have Professor Chris French, who's here from the University of London. He's will be downtown DC tomorrow at the American Psychological Association meeting, debating a session on experiments in parapsychology. He's a professor of the British Psychological Society and the Committee for Skeptical Inquiries, a distinguished supporter of the British Humanist Association, a member of the Scientific and Professional Advisory Board of the British False Memory Society. He's published over 100 articles and book chapters, and his main area of research is in the psychology of paranormal beliefs and anomalous experiences. So anyway, Professor French.
Okay, thank you. Is the sound okay? Right, okay. Well, thank you very much for coming out tonight to listen to me. Can everybody hear okay? Yeah? Yeah, great. Okay. What I'm going to do is just present you with an introduction to anomalistic psychology. So the very first question you're going to ask is, what the hell is anomalistic psychology? This is the definition that we have on my unit's website. Anomalistic psychology may be defined as the study of extraordinary phenomena of behaviour and experience, including but not restricted to those which are often labelled paranormal. It's directed towards understanding bizarre experiences that many people have without assuming a priori that there is anything paranormal involved. It entails attempting to explain paranormal and related beliefs and ostensibly paranormal experiences in terms of known or knowable psychological and physical factors. So generally, we are taking a skeptical approach to ostensibly paranormal experiences. We're seeing if we can come up with alternative, non-paranormal explanations, and we're then trying to put those explanations to the test, because that's important. We don't take a hard-line skeptical position where we say, we know that paranormal forces could not possibly exist, because I don't think that's very open-minded or very scientific. And so one of the things that we do is we do sometimes actually test directly paranormal claims. The main thrust of our research tends to be trying to come up with non-paranormal explanations for ostensibly paranormal experiences, but we do try and directly test paranormal claims. I'm going to be spending 25 minutes tomorrow talking about our attempts to replicate Bem's recent research into precognition and our failure to do so and the possible reasons for that. I'm not going to be talking about that now, but I want to give you next an example of the kind of research where we do test a paranormal claim. In this particular case, it's dowsing. I'll show you the video clip and then I'll talk about it.
The so-called evidence for psychic phenomena is not robust, but will-o'-the-wisp. The more we look at it, the weaker it becomes. The alleged detection of water through dowsing is not obviously ridiculous. It might work, but does it? The only way to tell is through a rigorous experiment.
How does dowsing work? That's the #1 question, and nobody can answer you. Well, I reckon I'm convinced that something is helping me to dowse. One of the earlier chaps thinks it's God.
How do you do it then? What's your principle of dowsing?
I think the question, and I expect God to respond in a way that I understand. I'm going to expect the right-hand one to point to the camera and the left-hand one straight forward.
Yeah, okay.
Look,
Good.
it's following him round.
Yes. And have you done the test yet in the tent?
Yes, I did.
Yeah, and what was the result?
I was going to get 6 or 8, 100%.
Yeah, and what happened?
1.
So what do you make of that then?
He's having his laugh, isn't he? He loves a joke.
Yes.
You don't realise.
Do I get second goes at it?
Oh yeah, you can have as many goes.
The psychologist Chris French thinks there may be a simpler explanation. He has devoted his career to investigating claims of the paranormal. And now he has set up this test for dowsing, a properly controlled double-blind trial. In each of these rows, just one container, chosen at random, holds a bottle of water. All the rest contain sand. Neither the dowsers nor the tester are allowed to know where the water is until the boxes are opened. So there are no unintentional giveaways.
Have another go.
Safeguards like this make the double-blind trial one of the crowning achievements of scientific reason.
Okay, put it on the end one then.
Number 6 again.
I'd say so.
Okay. Right. What you'll typically find when you talk to dowsers is they'll give you lots and lots of anecdotal evidence, lots of stories about how they discovered a leak in their neighbour's pipes and so on and so forth. But there are always other possible explanations there.
Yes.
What we're trying to do is set up conditions which would rule out any of those other explanations. But then we get down to the very fundamental, basic issue: can the dowsers actually do what they think they can do?
Yes.
Okay. I think it's 4. No, I think it's 4.
So shall we see how well you've done? This is sand.
In that case, I can't do this.
This is the waters in number 5. Sand again. This time, guess was bin number 3. And this time you're correct. That's water. And I'm afraid that's sand.
Yes, well actually there are 2 possible words.
Final trial, it's sand again, I'm afraid.
In that case, I'm 100% wrong again.
Well, you got 1 right out of 6, which is what we'd expect by chance. So far, they're performing pretty much in line with mean chance expectation. In other words, guesswork.
Yeah.
So no one has scored more than 2 hits out of 6.
3.
3.
The people you've been testing, do they understand why they're being put through the double-blind procedure?
I think once we've explained it to them, then they appreciate why someone who is perhaps sceptical or doubtful about their claims would see that that was necessary. What's interesting is it doesn't actually tend to dent their confidence at all.
Which suggests that they're completely sincere.
I think they are completely sincere.
Yes.
And they're typically very, very surprised when we run them through a series of trials and actually say at the end of the day, well, your performance is no better than would expect just on the basis of guesswork. And then what typically happens is they'll make up all kinds of reasons, some might say excuses, as to why they didn't pass that particular test.
I feel the whole test is wrong.
I'm shocked beyond words that this has happened. But I did say from the outset, couldn't we just sort out some grey blocks and some scaffold boards so that I can walk above it, which is what I would routinely do and I've done for 40 years.
Who knows where or what bottles were in what tubs.
That's the whole point, isn't it? That's the whole point.
But if you understand dowsing like I do, you'll understand that everything leaves an image.
This state of denial is extraordinary. Even when confronted with hard fact, these dowsers prefer not to face up to truth, but retain their delusion.
Okay, now, I don't know what that weird noise is personally, but it's all right, fine, okay. As long as I have an explanation, I'm happy. A rational explanation, right. Speaking of rational explanations, one thing they didn't include in the coverage in the programme, that was a series that Richard Dawkins starred in, as you could see, Enemies of Reason. One thing they didn't include was the fact that, and I think this is really important, we tested those dowsers initially in an open test condition where they knew the location of the water. So initially we had a bottle of water, a bottle of sand. Do you get a dowsing response? Yes, they do. Over the water, nothing over the sand. We then put the bottles into containers. We closed them right in front of them. They knew where the water was. They knew where the sand was. Do you still get a response? Yes, they did. Now, that's really important, and they didn't include it in the programme, which is very annoying, because the obvious explanation, as you will well know, is that dowsing works via the ideomotor effect. It's non-conscious muscular movements. When you know what the answer is supposed to be, your own expectation causes you to actually move the dowsing rods You don't realise consciously that you're doing it. It feels as if it's at a force from somewhere else, but that is the explanation. Now, we kind of quite like doing that kind of thing for several reasons. It ticks lots of boxes for us. One, it's really good in terms of public education and public engagement to get across the idea of the importance of double-blind designs, etc., etc. It's very simple and it's very straightforward. Everybody can understand that if dowsing really works, they ought to have been able to pass that test. And they couldn't. They performed exactly at chance level. So we like doing that kind of thing. But we've tested lots of other psychic claims. I'll just give you a couple of other examples. We tested this lady here, Patricia Putt. We being myself, Richard Wiseman, and various other people. Patricia is a professional psychic. She claims that she can talk to the spirits and they will tell her things about her clients. So she can do readings. She doesn't need them to open their mouths, say anything. There's no chance that she's basing it on non-verbal cues or any of the other factors. It's not cold reading, she says. So we carried out a test where we got 10 volunteers. We were doing this test on behalf of someone you may be familiar with, this gentleman, James Randi. Patricia had put in for the $1 million challenge, and as you know, James insists that people pass a preliminary test before they go for the formal challenge, the preliminary test being carried out by people that he knows and trusts. So we've ended up doing a few preliminary tests, and of course if the test is carried out properly they never pass it, so James doesn't have to do any work. And that's what happened in this case. We got in 10 volunteers. We actually, this is how our volunteers began. But obviously there's all sorts of cues you might pick up from a young lady such as this, for example. You can see she's probably quite kind of fashion conscious, takes care of her appearance, etc. That might influence the reading she was given. So we didn't have people going in that state. We had the readings being done while they were in that state. They had their backs to Patricia. They did not speak to her. She said she was happy with this. It's very important that the people being tested are happy with the conditions that the test is being carried out. She did 10 readings for 10 different volunteers. They all then came in. They didn't know which reading was for them. They had to choose the reading they thought was for them. She didn't have to get 100% right. I can't remember what the criteria was. I think we said 5 or more right out of 10. She got none. None of the volunteers chose the reading that was intended for them out of all 10. Initially, her reaction was quite surprising. Initially, her reaction was, well, it was a fair test. I thought I could pass this test. I couldn't do it. Within 2 days, 3 days, it had become, it wasn't a fair test. We're used to this kind of thing. You know, we get them to sign something in advance saying it's a fair test, but inevitably when they fail it, they decide, no, it wasn't actually after all, but that's what we're used to. We've also tested Derek Ogilvie. Derek Ogilvie is a guy in the UK who calls himself a baby psychic. He claims he can read the minds of babies even before they can talk, and surprisingly, these babies are not just thinking things like, oops, I've just pooed myself, or I'm really hungry. They're actually really concerned about various things that are going on within the family. They seem to be obsessed with cars. You know, the number of them that are kind of worried about the transmission. I mean, strangely enough, Derek has quite an interest in cars, but I'm sure that's entirely coincidental. We did the same kind of test with Derek for a program called Extraordinary People. Derek failed miserably on our test, performed exactly chance level. Poor guy was in tears afterwards, and I'm there trying to comfort him, saying, look, your followers won't listen to us. They won't believe our test. Don't worry, you'll be fine. Poor guy was going off to Florida the next day to be tested by Randi, and guess what? He performed at chance level there too. A guy called Chris Robinson, the dream detective, who claims he can dream future events. I won't go into the details. He failed. Okay. One of the things which motivates our research is the fact that, you know, I'm a psychologist, and you look at public opinion data, you look at reports from all around the world, any society, at any point in history, anywhere in the world, and you will find people reporting strange experiences, people reporting amazing powers. It's a universal thing. Now, it can only mean one of two things. Either paranormal forces really do exist. Now, if that's the case, then science ought to get over its prejudices and just try and study it and understand it the way that science tries to understand everything else. Or alternatively, if paranormal forces don't really exist, and what's happening is that people are interpreting events, interpreting experiences in paranormal terms, we can learn a huge amount about human psychology by studying these experiences. So either way, it's worth taking them seriously and trying to explain what's going on. So that's what we do. Now, in terms of how we go about doing it, one of the main themes that runs through anomalistic psychology is cognitive biases. I mean, we've got the most amazing cognitive systems. You know, every second of your waking life, you're doing stuff with your cognitive system that, as yet, the most advanced computers in the world can't do. And we just take it all for granted. But it is truly amazing. I mean, the fact that, you know, I'm standing here now, and for me, trying to get across what, for me, are some fairly high-level, complex kind of messages, and I'm doing that. Something's happening in my head, I don't know what. Something's happening whereby certain neurons are firing that are ultimately causing the muscles in my larynx to vibrate. That's making the sound, that's making the air molecules between me and you vibrate. That's hitting your eardrums. That's being translated into neural impulses that make their way to your auditory cortex and then other areas of your brain. And hopefully, if you followed all that, you still understand what I'm saying. And that is about as near to a miracle as you can get. But these amazing cognitive systems we have are prone to systematic biases. And it's possible that some of these systematic biases underlie situations where we think something paranormal's happened when maybe it hasn't. And so, as I say, a lot of our research is based on that. So a lot of the research we do is taking paradigms from mainstream experimental psychology and seeing if we can apply them to understand ostensibly paranormal experiences. Give you one example, well, I'll give you a few examples. First one is a study we published back in 2002. One possibility we were interested in was the idea that maybe sometimes in certain situations people believe that they are using their psychic powers, their intuition, to try and make a guess about something, and it turns out to be true. And if it happens a lot, they might think, well, hey, maybe I'm psychic. I seem to be pretty good at this kind of thing. Well, maybe they're psychic. Or maybe they're picking up on information that was available in the environment, but they weren't consciously aware of it. And so we wanted to look at this possibility. What we did was to get participants, and we told them they were taking part in a computerized ESP task. In fact, a computerized precognition task where we wanted them to guess which of 5 different symbols the computer would randomly select on every trial. What we didn't tell them was that on half the trials, we were going to subliminally prime them with the right answer. So by subliminally, I mean we presented the right answer so briefly that they weren't consciously aware that anything had been presented. And you have to be very careful and check that that really is the situation, and we were very careful. So on half the trials, we subliminally flashed up the right answer before they made their guess. On the other half, we didn't. We got people to fill in a questionnaire measuring something called transliminality, which I won't go into details about now, but you can ask questions about if you want to. For the time being, transliminality is a pencil and paper measure, and it correlates with paranormal belief and reports of paranormal experiences. What we found was that our high transliminals got more hits than mean chance expectation, than just guesswork, but only on the prime trials. On the non-prime trials, they responded at chance level. The low transliminals responded at chance level regardless. But you can imagine that if you said to these high transliminals, how are you able to do this? How come you can get more right than we would expect just by chance? They wouldn't know. To them, it would seem quite rational to say, well, I don't know, maybe I'm psychic. So, it supported that general line of argument. Just for the record, we found no evidence of ASP. We did look. Another factor we've become increasingly interested in over recent years is memory. And in particular, eyewitness testimony. Typically, when you're dealing with paranormal claims, you're not dealing with the event, the experience itself, you're dealing with someone's report of the experience. So obviously it becomes crucially important to know, can we rely on eyewitness testimony? Now I'm sure you're all very familiar with the mountains of research that look at staged crimes and show that people tend to misremember them, sometimes in quite dramatic ways. What might be slightly more surprising is that even simple everyday stimuli are often misremembered. Just an example of this, on clocks and watches with Roman numerals on them, how is the 4 represented? Is it like this, I, or is it like this, IV? How many people think it's I? Put your hands up. How many people think it's IV? Put your hands up. The vast majority think it's IV, which obviously means you're wrong, otherwise I wouldn't have been asking the question. Sorry? I'm talking about clocks and watches, yeah. On clocks and watches, and only on clocks and watches, there's this very unusual way of representing the number 4. And yet, most of you I hadn't noticed it until one of my daughters pointed it out, What's happening here, we did a little study, me and my wife. This is our kitchen clock. We did a little study where we presented the kitchen clock to different groups of people. In the first group we said, look at this clock. And after 1 minute we put it to one side and said, right, now draw it from memory. For the second group we said, look at this clock, we're going to show it to you for 1 minute and then we're going to ask you to draw it from memory. For the third group we said, look at this clock, copy it. And it remained in view. The copiers got it right. The people who had to do it from memory, whether they were forewarned or not, got it wrong. What's happening is, it's an example of what we call top-down processing. Your beliefs, your expectations influence what you think you must have seen. I mean, from now on, whenever you see a clock or a watch with Roman numerals on them, it's 95% plus will be like that. And you'll think, yes, that smart-ass Brit, he was right. Anyway. Okay. So as I say, now top-down processing comes into play in a lot. Obviously, your beliefs, your expectations, the way you interpret ambiguous stimuli. Another issue that we are interested in is something called memory conformity. Memory conformity refers to the fact that if you've only got a single uncorroborated eyewitness to an event, then you probably don't give that as much evidential value as if you've got multiple witnesses and they're all telling more or less the same story. And that's probably quite a sensible thing to do. But one thing you should bear in mind is that if people witness something unusual, like a crime or a possible UFO sighting or the Loch Ness Monster or something that maybe was a Loch Ness Monster, they are going to discuss it with each other. And one person's account might influence another person's memory. Now, this has been looked at in a forensic context, and it's a genuine effect. We know that sometimes one eyewitness's account can distort another eyewitness's memory. We thought it would be interesting to look at in an anomalistic context. And so we replicated a study that was carried out by Richard Wiseman. It's a very interesting study in its own right. What he did was to show a video of an alleged psychic doing some psychokinetic metal bending. The guy obviously was really just a conjurer, very skilled conjurer. The interesting bit came when he puts the key, which had already been bent by sleight of hand, down on the table. There's a nice close-up, and the psychic says, if you look closely, you'll see it's still bending. Now, it isn't. There's no question, it is not bending. But those who hear that suggestion, 40% of them report they think the key carries on bending. If they don't hear that suggestion, but everything else was exactly the same, then they don't think the key carried on bending. So a really simple manipulation like that can have a really strong effect. Now, Richard found that in 2 studies. We replicated it, but we found that believers were more susceptible to this suggestion. But we also added a memory conformity element. We had a stooge subject who also watched the video at the same time, who either said, yes, it did carry on bending, or no, it didn't. And that had a further additive effect. So if you've got the verbal suggestion from the psychic and you've got the stooge subject saying, yes, it carried on bending, 60% of those people then reported that they thought the key carried on bending. I published a review back in 2003 on two different areas, really. One was the relevance of eyewitness testimony, and the other was the important area of false memories. I mean, the difference being that eyewitness testimony, you're talking about the areas that can creep in when people have actually witnessed an event, but they misremember certain aspects of it in the retelling. False memories is when you have apparent memories for things that just never happened at all. And of course, this became a really hot topic when people, particularly in this country, but also it happened in the UK and across Europe and around the world, but people were going into therapy for everyday kind of psychological problems like depression, anxiety, problems sleeping, problems in relationships, etc., having no memories of being the victims of childhood sexual abuse when they went in for the therapy, but when the time they came out, they had detailed memories of being sexually abused, usually by their parents. And yeah, this is really serious stuff. This is causing families to be torn apart, people are ending up in prison. It's really important to know, can we trust these apparent recovered memories? Well, we now know, thanks to Elizabeth Loftus and similar researchers, that it's amazingly easy to implant false memories in a large proportion, a minority, but a sizable minority of the population. And there's now a number of different experimental techniques to do that. We now know that there are certain psychological variables that correlate with susceptibility to false memories. They include things like dissociativity, the tendency to go off into kind of mildly altered states of consciousness, you know, kind of people who kind of don't quite seem to be with it a lot of the time. Fantasy proneness, absorption, hypnotic susceptibility, they all correlate with susceptibility to false memories. And interestingly, they all correlate with paranormal belief and reports of paranormal experiences. So this suggests that some of those reports of paranormal experiences may well be based on nothing more than false memories. We wanted to try and find some direct evidence for this. So we carried out a study where we gave 100 participants a news coverage questionnaire. Now, interestingly, just as we were having our meal before we came in, we got talking about 9/11, and everybody had very vivid memories of where they were, who they were with, what they were doing at the time when they first saw that very dramatic news footage. And it looked like we were doing a study of that. It's called flashbulb memory. It turns out, by the way, that even those flashbulb memories are not as accurate as we once thought they were, but that's another story. It looked like we were doing a study of flashbulb memories. We were asked people, where were you, who were you with, what were you doing when you first saw footage of the Twin Towers collapsing, or Saddam's statue being toppled in Basra, etc., etc. But we included in one item which had never been caught on camera. So there was no footage for it. Interestingly, in line with previous research, we found that over a third of our participants, they could remember where they were, who they were with, what they were doing when they first saw this non-existent footage. Not only that, they could tell us whether it was in colour or black and white. They could tell us whether there was a commentary, if so, what language it was in. And interestingly, those people scored higher on measures of paranormal belief and experience. So it supports this general line of argument. And the effect has been replicated both by us and by independent researchers, so it looks like it's a genuine effect. One example of what I assume is a false memory that we're very interested in relates to alien abduction claims. We published a study a few years back where we compared a group of experiencers, that's the politically correct term for people who think they've been abducted by aliens, with a control group. We took measures. Sorry?
That's
politically correct term for people who think they've been abducted by aliens. Okay. Yeah, don't call them abductees, they don't like that. They want to be called experiencers. Okay? So we did. We measured dissociativity, absorption, fantasy proneness, paranormal belief and experience, all things that correlate with susceptibility to false memories, and they were in fact significantly different. We also looked at the incidence of sleep paralysis. How many of you have heard of sleep paralysis? Quick show of hands. Most of you, not necessarily everybody. Okay, sleep paralysis is something that is a really fascinating topic in its own right. And we're very interested in this. I'll come back to the sleep paralysis in a while. This is for any of you who don't know what happens in an alien abduction, I don't think there's any of you really, but I'll go through it anyway. This is a typical report from a paper by Susan Blackmore in New Scientist back in the mid-90s. This was a composite based on Sue's research with people who claimed to be abducted. She put together what was a kind of fictional but typical kind of report. I woke up in the middle of the night and everything looked odd and strangely lit. At the end of my bed was a 4 feet high grey alien. Its spindly, thin body supported a huge head with 2 enormous, slanted, liquid black eyes. It compelled me telepathically to follow and led me into a spaceship along curved corridors to an examination room full of tables on which people lay. Now, these are the little blighters that tend to do the business these days. They're called greys, and they're about to put this probe somewhere really interesting. Okay. She goes on, I was forced to lie down while they painfully examined me, extracted ova, or in the case of men, sperm, and implanted something in my nose. Nobody knows what these implants are for. Some people claim they're mind control devices. Some people claim they're just tracking devices. So, like we would with a wild animal, next time we want to pick them up and see where they've got to, we know where they are. I could see jars containing half-human, half-alien fetuses and a nursery full of silent, sickly children. When I eventually found myself back in bed, several hours had gone by, and here they are putting an implant. I should point out, by the way, these are drawings, these are not photographs. Okay. Now, I got a really interesting example of memory distortion from one of my students one year. I sent them a question on the exam about psychology of alien abduction, and this particular student had kind of got the wrong end of the stick, because what the student came out with was one of the most famous cases of alien abduction was when Susan Blackmore was abducted by aliens. She was taken on board a spaceship where she was painfully medically examined, her ova were extracted and stuffed up her nose. Not quite right. I mean, one of the factors which seems to be important is this thing called sleep paralysis. Now, there will definitely be people in this room who've experienced it. In its most basic form, it's very common. You're half awake, you're half asleep, and you realise you can't move. Quick show of hands if you've experienced that. Yeah, that looks about right, about 40%, yeah. Now, the reason this happens, you all experience sleep paralysis. Well, you all have sleep paralysis every night. You don't necessarily experience it because usually when it happens, you're going through REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep. And that's the stage of sleep that's typically associated with dreaming, and the muscles of the body are actually paralysed, presumably to stop you acting out the actions of the dream. Of course, you're not aware of this because you're aware of what's going on in your dream. But occasionally something goes a little bit skew-whiff, and you become aware of the fact you regain normal consciousness and you can't move. And that can be pretty damn scary. If that's not scary enough, in about 1 in 20 people, you get associated symptoms. You get a sense of presence. You feel that there's someone or something in the room with you, and whatever it is, they mean you no good at all. You get auditory, visual, or tactile hallucinations. You might hear voices or footsteps or mechanical sounds. You might see lights moving around the room or dark shadows or horrible, grotesque monsters. You might feel as if you're being touched or as if you're being dragged out of the bed. Sometimes it turns into a full-blown out-of-body experience. There's difficulty breathing. There's a sense of pressure on the chest. And maybe not surprisingly, there's intense fear. So obviously, if you get the whole lot, it can be an absolutely terrifying experience. Now, whenever you talk about sleep paralysis, you are contractually obliged to show these images. This is a kind of artistic depiction of sleep paralysis where you can see that you've got, this is by Fuseli from back in the 1780s, I think it was. And you've got the grotesque figures. You've got this monstrous demon sitting on the chest and the sense of pressure on the chest. And interestingly, sleep paralysis does tend to be associated with sleeping on your back. You're more likely to experience it if you sleep on your back than if you don't. But if you sleep in that position, to be honest, you're asking for trouble. I mean, that's just stupid.
Is there any connection with the symptoms of sleep paralysis and panic attacks? Is that at all?
That's been looked at, yeah, because it's very, very similar in terms of the symptoms. I mean, the panic attack involves a lot of the same physiological symptoms. There's one study which looked at, interestingly, what they did was to look at people who were suffering from panic attacks and sleep paralysis. They treated the panic attacks using cognitive behavioural therapy, and that reduced the incidence of the sleep paralysis as well. So, yeah. Anything that can disrupt the normal sleep pattern is likely to increase the chances that in susceptible individuals they will experience sleep paralysis. Oh, this is a picture painted by Fuseli 10 years later. She's still in the same position, the stupid woman. Anyway. Okay, one of the really interesting things about sleep paralysis is the different cross-cultural interpretations. What's the link with alien abductions? Well, if you read the ufology literature, you'll find that there are certain self-proclaimed experts who say if you've experienced any of those symptoms, you have probably been abducted by aliens, and they've wiped your memory for the rest of the event. Now, in other cultures, they don't go for that interpretation. They might have their own interpretation, usually, again, supernatural in nature. So in Newfoundland, they talk about the old hag who comes and sits on the sleeper's chest and suffocates them. In Japan, they talk about kanashibari, which, again, is a nocturnal spirit attack. St. Lucia, this is one of my favourites. They call it kokmar, and it's the spirits of unbaptized children that crawl onto the sleeper's chest and throttle them. So do sleep well, all of you, tonight. In Europe in the Middle Ages, the same core phenomenon was interpreted as attacks by sex-crazed demons. They would come and have their wicked way with you while you slept. I should be so lucky. That's the male version. Incubus literally translates as one who crushes, and that's the female version. I mean, I'm not sure out of the two of them who looks the most shocked, to be perfectly honest, but, you know. But you can see, again, it's the same core experience that's been interpreted with a different cultural overlay in all these different situations. So how do you get from thinking that you've had this scary experience, you don't know what to make of it, but why do you think you've been abducted by aliens? Well, as I say, in the UFO literature, there are people who will tell you, these people are experts, so they must know what they're talking about. That's what's happened to you. So now you've got the idea, well, hey, that does describe this weird experience. It does mean I'm not crazy. I need to go and see a hypnotist and recover those memories. Because you've bought into the idea that hypnosis is some kind of magical key that can unlock hidden or repressed memories. Well, guess what? It isn't. What it does is it provides a context whereby you produce a narrative based on expectations, belief, bits of real memories, prior knowledge, fantasy, imagination. It's all woven together, and then it seems so real while it's being replayed in your head that you think it's a real memory, but it isn't. It's a false memory. The same kind of techniques are used, whether we're talking about, I hesitate to say this, kind of ordinary childhood sexual abuse, but you know what I mean, satanic ritualized sexual abuse, past life regression. All the same techniques are being used. If you accept the idea that a lot of the claims, we can buy into the idea that recovered memories of childhood sexual abuse might be real because we know childhood sexual abuse does occur. It absolutely does, obviously. But if you buy into that, you've also got to buy into the idea about alien abductions and the, past lives and all this other stuff, because it's the same techniques. One of the things I knew from my research into false memories was that absorption correlates with susceptibility to false memories. Absorption is the tendency that people have to become completely absorbed in what they're doing, whether it's reading a novel, doing a crossword, watching a film on TV. They're completely cut off the outside world. And it seemed quite likely that people who were like that would be more likely to be inattentionally blind. And I wondered whether that meant that people who were intentionally blind tend to also have higher levels of paranormal belief. And that made sense because I'm forever being faced with people who say, well, how do you account for my experience? And then they'll tell you their particular experience. And you'll think, well, maybe there was something else in the environment at the time that you just didn't notice. Maybe there was someone else in the room Or maybe this happened or that happened. No, I'd have noticed that, I'd have seen that. I think, yeah, maybe you would, maybe you wouldn't. Anyway, we put it to the test. We used an inattentional blindness task, not the one that I've just shown you, but one that's conceptually very similar. Participants were instructed to watch letters bouncing around a screen, ignore the black letters, and count in their heads every time one of the 4 white letters hit the frame of the display. And halfway through, a red cross moves slowly across the background. It takes 7 seconds to go across the screen. Do they see the red cross? What we found was about half the participants did and half the participants didn't. And interestingly, the inattentionally blind scored significantly higher than the non-inattentionally blind on absorption, as we'd predicted, and paranormal belief and experience. We then thought, well, let's try and get at what's causing this. We did a second experiment where we replicated it, and we also looked at working memory capacity. The idea here was, if you don't have very high working memory capacity, then you're using up all your cognitive resources on the primary task, and you don't have anything left over to pick up on this irrelevant stimulus. And in fact, we replicated the results, and this should actually say that they scored, the inattentionally blind scored lower on working memory capacity, and I must get around to correcting that slide at some point. The definition I put up at the beginning referred to events and experiences that are often labelled as paranormal, but they don't have to be. So that means I can look at anything that I think is interesting, really. And one of the things that I find really interesting is belief in conspiracy theories. I've got a PhD student at the moment who's doing some interesting research on this. I want to show you a clip from another TV program. This was one on belief in conspiracy theories. The program describes this as being an experiment. I certainly wouldn't describe it as being an experiment, but I thought it was quite an interesting demonstration, so I'll just show it to you.
Professor Chris French and Dr. Patrick Lehman are 2 of the world's authorities on conspiracy thinking, and they think that they might know what's going on.
As psychologists, we're not principally interested in whether one particular conspiracy theory is true or another one isn't. We're interested ultimately in a psychological perspective, which is why do people believe in these and why do people not believe in them?
Both Chris and Patrick strongly believe that some people are more likely to believe in conspiracies than others. Incredibly, they also think that they can predict who those people are. To find out if they were right, they decided to conduct an experiment.
Okay, guys, thank you for coming. On the table in front of you is a sheet of paper, and I want you to fill that sheet of paper in now. There's a series of questions. At the start, if you can put a little bit of information about you, and then just answer those questions in the way that you feel. Okay?
30 students took part. None of the questions relate to conspiracies. Instead, they test 3 other psychological factors that Chris and Patrick predict will go hand in hand with a belief in conspiracy theories. If you have low levels of trust in the people around you, if you feel alienated from society, and if you're quick to make false assumptions based on partial evidence, then Chris and Patrick predict you will be more likely to believe in conspiracy theories. With the papers in, it was time to pick 2 groups, made up of the people with the 6 highest and the 6 lowest scores. Now, the success of the whole experiment rested on how the groups reacted to a brand new conspiracy that Chris and Patrick had invented themselves.
The government is using mobile phone technology to track everyone all the time.
Okay, so do you think that the government is using that technology to track where you are at different times?
That's the statement. What do you think about that?
If their theory was right, Patrick's group would be more likely to believe the mobile phone conspiracy, while Chris's would be more sceptical.
And this is the thing that we want to know at the end of the day, whether you'd agree with this or disagree with it or you don't know. The government is using mobile phone technology to track everyone all the time.
I strongly don't agree with that.
I mean, why would they want to? The government would be out in no time. simple fact is the statement was watching everybody, and I don't believe they're watching everybody, but they can watch the people they need to watch. So
I don't think they do it with bad intentions or as a violation of our rights. Violation of our rights if they take advantage of it when we haven't done anything wrong.
But can you think of the huge computer system it would require to have every single person in the country's whereabouts on a system?
The logistics of it is completely incapable of being, and especially the government, there's no way they can pull it off.
It's way too conspiracy theory for me to agree with.
Chris's group were looking every bit as sceptical as the scientists had predicted. So would Patrick's group be any more conspiratorial?
I'm not sure if they bug conversations, but I'm sure they must be able to pinpoint you are somewhere on the globe to like 30 metres.
Yeah. And also the mobile phone companies can track where you are, and the police can do that as well.
They might look at people in general, and like if they're being normal, if their behaviour is normal. But then if they deviate from this behaviour, they might, I don't know, track them a bit more cautiously and have a look at them deeper.
They might not have the purpose to track everyone, but as soon as they have the opportunity to and the ability to, then I would suspect that they would quite happily buy into that.
It would be nice to do a vote now and see what you all think. Can you hold your phone up if you think that it's very likely or quite likely that the government is using this technology to track where everyone is all the time? Hold it up if you agree that that's quite likely. So we've just got the votes in, and all 6 people think that it is quite likely.
So how would Chris's group vote?
Is there anybody who feels that they think that this is a possibility, that the government is using mobile phone technology to track everyone all the time?
No, the simple answer is they don't do it.
How many would say 1, certainly not? Can I have a quick show of hands? Okay, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 out of the 6 of you would say certainly not. Okay, so when it came to actually getting the group to discuss this statement, we got a very clear consensus emerging. 5 out of the 6 people in this group thought that was definitely not true, and the remaining person thought that it was unlikely. So it's very, very clear judgment there from this group that they don't think this is happening.
The experiment was a resounding success. It seems that trust, alienation, and the evidence on which you base your opinions are key to determining whether or not you will believe in conspiracies.
Packet of peanuts for anyone who knows who that is.
Sir, I have a question.
Yes, certainly.
Well, so in this group, it seems that the subjects can communicate with each other. Don't you think the opinion of any one of them might contaminate?
Oh, absolutely. No. I mean, like I said, I do not count that as an experiment at all. It was an interesting demonstration where we essentially kind of formed 2 focus groups, and we got them to discuss it. You know, we didn't try and lead the conversation or steer it in any way. We wanted to see what would emerge. I mean, on the one hand, yes, you're right. On the other hand, in terms of ecological validity, in terms of how conspiracy theories emerge in natural situations, people talk about them. So, yeah. But as I say, I'm not claiming for 1 second that was a properly controlled experiment. I thought it was an interesting demonstration.
It certainly wasn't double-blind.
Oh, it was absolutely not double-blind. Absolutely not, no. I mean, it would be interesting to kind of follow up on some of those leads in properly controlled studies. Now, as I say, one of the lines of research we've been looking at related to conspiracy theories, and it's interesting that this ties in with more general research on anomalistic psychology and paranormal belief. There are several studies that have shown that believers in the paranormal are poorer at certain types of reasoning than non-believers. For example, Paul Rogers and colleagues have repeatedly shown this effect with respect to what's called the conjunction fallacy. How many of you have heard of the conjunction fallacy? Woo! Okay, 1. All right, this is the standard example that everybody gives, which I will now give to you. Linda is 31 years old, single, outspoken, and very bright. She majored in philosophy. As a student, she was deeply concerned with issues of discrimination and social justice, and also participated in anti-nuclear demonstrations. Now, the question you are then asked, having been given this character sketch, is, which is more probable, that Linda is a bank teller, or that Linda is a bank teller and is active in the feminist movement?
Information.
Well, yeah, you just have to say, on the basis of the information you've got, which do you think is more likely?
first one. The first
Fair enough.
The first one's much more probable because the second adds a condition.
Absolutely. The first one must be more likely because this is a subset of this. The bank tellers who are also feminists are still bank tellers. And the first set includes the bank tellers who are not feminists. So it must be a bigger set, so this statement must be truer. However, what Tversky and Kahneman found was that in one of their studies, 85% chose option 2, which is logically impossible. But of course, what they've been influenced by is that character sketch which I gave you, which was a stereotypical feminist, or it was intended to be at least.
85% of what? Of whom?
Of the sample in their experiment. I don't know, I can't remember what the sample was, but 85% of in their experiment. So, but it's a typical kind of fallacy, typical logical fallacy that people make. It's called the conjunction fallacy. Now, as I've said, this bias has been shown to correlate with paranormal belief, but we carried out a study looking at whether it correlates with conspiratorial thinking, and we found it correlated even more strongly than it does with paranormal belief. So there's some interesting avenues to go down there. Okay, last bit of the talk, and then you can all have a drink. Okay, this is the fun bit, hopefully. Top-down processing I've mentioned before. It's kind of accepted in cognitive psychology that when you're kind of just going around interacting with the world, you've got two sources of information. The idea is that you have a kind of cognitive model of the world around you and your place in it, and that model is being constantly updated. The model is based on the bottom-up information, the information that's coming from the senses, but also top-down influences. So what you know about the world, what you believe about the world, what your expectations are. And particularly when you get ambiguous stimuli, those top-down influences are going to be stronger. So I'm going to give you a few examples, some of which you'll have seen before, I'm sure. Pareidolia, defined by Robert Todd Carroll as a type of illusion or misperception involving a vague or obscure stimulus being perceived as something clear and distinct. You know, the kind of tendency we all have to see faces in the clouds. I'll give you a few examples, as I say, not meant to be too serious. This is an aerial photograph of a football pitch in England. This is where a team called Crystal Palace play. It's at Selhurst Park. And some people think they can see a kind of Turin shroud-like image of Christ in the patterns on the pitch there. So, I don't know if you can see that. Yeah, it's kind of, it's not awfully clear, but we wondered if they should rename the ground. It's Crystal Palace, you know. I didn't make up the captions for these slides. This is a woman who's seen the image of Christ in the burn marks on her burrito, and you can see she's obviously delighted by her discovery. This is one you will have seen before, probably. This is Nun or Bun, the Immaculate Confection. This was a cinnamon bun that I think was found in New York, Delhi, which someone thought bore a striking resemblance to Mother Teresa. Another more recent example, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Toast. This is a grilled cheese sandwich, which someone felt there was an image of either, I'm not sure whether it's Madonna or the Madonna. I think it's the Madonna. This went for $28,000 on eBay. It's worth keeping your eyes open for these things, it really is. Now, the best example, I'm sure some of you will have heard this before. Can I just say, it was me who first started doing this demonstration. Since then, it's been nicked by Michael Shermer, Richard Wiseman, Simon Singh, the list goes on. Anyway, I'm not bitter. Yeah, I am. This is the best example of the power of top-down processing. How many of you have heard this before, just out of interest? I'm sure some of you have. But a lot of you haven't, and that's good, because it's when you hear it the first time, it really hits home. It does, actually. It's great, isn't it? There's an idea put around that there are satanic messages embedded in rock music. It's particularly American Christian fundamentalists that tend to put this idea around. And the idea is that you don't hear the messages when you play the records forwards. You only hear them when you play the records backwards. But the claim is that the messages can still get through to your subconscious and influence your behaviour. This is what we psychologists technically refer to as a load of old bollocks. So that's a technical term there. Now, I'm going to play the clip to you forwards, first of all, partly just because I like it, and partly to test the sound system, that the volume's okay. Then I'm going to play it backwards, and your job will be to listen out for the satanic message. Then I'm going to tell you what the message is, and then play it again. And the interesting thing will be that once you know what... my prediction is, first time you hear it, you won't be able to make out what the message is. You might make out 1 or 2 words. Second time, when I've told you what you're supposed to hear, you will hear the message as clear as a bell. And you will wonder how you missed it the first time. Now, just to be very clear, the reason you missed it the first time is because it isn't there. Okay? So here we go.
If there's a bustle in your hedgerow, don't be alone there. It's just a sprinkling for the May Queen. Yes, there are 2 paths you can go by, but in the long run, and there's still time to change the road you're on.
Okay, now I'm going to play the same clip, but backwards. So listen out for the satanic message. Any offers? Any messages? Not from the ones who've heard it before.
Well, I heard the word Satan 4 times, sort of evenly spread out, but I couldn't make any.
But you're only supposed to hear it twice, so you're obviously doubly damned. So here's the message that you were supposed to hear. Here's to my sweet Satan, the one whose little path would make me sad, whose power is Satan. He'll give you 666, supposedly the devil's number. There was a little tool shed, I can explain the tool shed, where he made us suffer, sad Satan. I'm now going to play the same clip again, and this time it will sound completely different, and you'll hear that message. Good, isn't it? I promise it's the same sound file.
That is incredible.
I think so too. And the only difference was that in the second time you heard it, you knew what you were supposed to hear.
That was clearer backwards than forward.
You can show this to your friends, because if you type in Stairway to Heaven backwards into Google, there's lots of sites. There's a particular site by Jeff Milner where he deliberately lets you play it without knowing what you're supposed to hear, and then play it when you do know what you're supposed to hear, and it makes all the difference.
I've seen something kind of on the same lines, where they have a video of a man's face, and you hear him saying his voice.
Ba and da.
Ba and
yeah,
da,
yeah, yeah.
And yeah.
This
if you watch his lips moving, you hear one thing, but if you look somewhere else,
that's right. Yeah.
Entirely, it's all about how your visual input influences how you interpret it.
That's the McGurk effect. When you, the McGurk effect is kind of related to this kind of thing, where if you have 2 different inputs, so you see someone, and I can't remember the details, but I think they're saying ba, and meanwhile, what you're hearing is da, and when you watch them both, when you watch and listen at the same time, you hear something in between phonemically, which is like ga. I can't remember that actually. I've made up those phonemes. I'm not sure they're the correct ones. And it's really interesting because you sit there and you close your eyes and it changes what you hear. You open your eyes and it's an amazing effect. But it's the same kind of thing. I mean, the point being that we are constructing this mental model all the time without being aware of it on the basis of incoming information. We're trying to make sense of what's coming in, but we're doing that on the basis of obviously what we already know and expect as well. Okay, just to finish off then, anomalistic psychology is sometimes seen as being kind of anti-parapsychology. Although, I am a card-carrying skeptic, I don't actually see it that way. If it is the case that the paranormal forces really do exist, then the challenge to the parapsychologist is to come up with a reliable, replicable demonstration of that. And if they do, that would be an amazing scientific breakthrough, and we'd all be very grateful. If they ever do that, then they actually owe us some gratitude, because we will have helped them to sort the wheat from the chaff, to sort what really is paranormal from what just looks like it's paranormal. But of course, it may turn out that there's nothing there but chaff. If that's the case, well, it's really interesting chaff anyway, so it's worth spending some time studying it. At the end of the day, it may well be that the truth isn't out there, the truth is up here. Okay, thank you for your attention.